All right, we are live today with Gretchen Rubin, who is the best-selling author of 4 books. But the topic that we are talking about today is happiness. Gretchen, every weekend I sit down and I write down my top 10 life goals, and intercontentedness and how I can practice that on a daily basis is something that always ranks number 3. And I would love to make that number 1. So why happiness? Of all the sort of human elements that we could be talking about today, why happiness?
Well, it's interesting. People sometimes really want to argue about what is happiness, or should we even want happiness? Maybe we should want contentment or bliss or fulfillment or life satisfaction or hedonic well-being. So I really love the openness of the term happiness. It's whatever you want. If you want peace, then you can want peace. If you want happiness, you can want happiness. Because I think sometimes people get very caught up in like really trying to understand the definition. And then they can also get caught up in like, well, how do I achieve it sort of perfectly 24/7, which is not very realistic. So I think it's more helpful to think about being happier, however, whatever that means for me in my circumstances, and moving in the right direction. So it's not about attaining a certain specific aim, but moving towards wherever it is that I think would make me, happier, healthier, more productive, and more creative.
But tell me about your journey specifically. How did you end up writing about happiness of all things?
Well, it was a very inconspicuous moment of my life. I was just finishing up another book, so I had a little bit, I had kind of this open bandwidth in my head. And I was stuck in a city bus, and I looked out the window and I thought, well, what do I want from life anyway? And I thought, well, I want to be happy. But I realized, like you say, it was number 3 or number 11. I didn't spend any time thinking about whether I was happy or how I could be happier. And I thought, I should have a happiness project. And I was like, yes. And I ran to the library, got a giant stack of books, contemporary science, ancient philosophy, memoirs, novels, pop culture, to try to figure out, can we make ourselves happier? What would I do if I were going to try to make myself happier? And it turns out that the subject of happiness is so limitless and exhausting that I decided to write my next book about it. And I've basically been researching different aspects of it ever since.
All right, so let's get into it. What are some of the habits? Tony Robbins always talks about your life being a reflection of your habits and your standards. What are some of the habits that we can start to instill in order to make happiness a daily endeavor?
Well, this is a crucial question, because I think a lot of times people are like, hey, hand me the 7. Like, what is the list? Do I need to get up at 6 a.m.? Do I need to get up at 5 a.m.? Like, am I supposed to, But what I've realized is that there is no magic one-size-fits-all solution. We all have to figure out our happiness project for ourselves. It has to reflect our own nature, our own interests, our own temperament, our own values. Because if somebody says, hey, you should get up, if something's important to you, you should get up and do it first thing in the morning. Well, that's good advice for me because I'm a morning person. But what if you're a night person and you're at your most productive and creative and energetic later in the day? That would not be setting yourself up for success. Sometimes people get frustrated with this. They're like, give me the answer. And I always say, well, what's the best way to cook an egg? And then people are like, well, it depends on how you like your eggs. Or maybe you don't like eggs at all. It's like, yeah, no one can tell you how. Now, there are certain basics like relationships. We are wired as humans to be made happier by connections with other people. But what that looks like and what those habits look like would be very different among different people. And another thing is self-knowledge. We sort of need self-knowledge if we are going to base our happiness on ourselves. So if you said relationships and self-knowledge, and then from there, we all have to do that self-scrutiny.
I love that you talked about the self-knowledge, because I did a whole module yesterday on the importance of reflection.
Yes.
We as women, or we as New Yorkers, I'm not sure where you in the country are.
News people.
Yeah, news
probably.
People. Just are constantly do. But do we sanction out time to actually reflect? Yep. What's working, what's not working? And so one of the habits that I'm happy to talk about is that every Sunday, I really say no to a lot of social commitments, including brunches. I, in fact, left a brunch early and everyone was like, why? I'm like, Sunday is an important strategy day for me. It's when I stop and I sit down, what's working, what's not working, and what do I need to change for the week coming up? So for me, that's one habit that I've instilled. But I'm curious, what are some of the habits that you've instilled in order to be a happier person?
Well, it's interesting. It sounds like you have a lot of habits related to planning. And now that I reflect on that, like I don't have a lot of habits related to planning. I guess I'm more focused on sort of action. I have, I wrote a book Better Than Before. It's just like, I love habits. I have so many habits. One habit I love is the 1 minute rule, which is anything I can do in less than a minute, I do without delay, whether that's filing a document or hanging up my coat instead of throwing it over a chair. And that gets rid of sort of that scum of like tiny tasks that can really slow us down as we go through. Another habit that back to basics. Now, some people are morning people or some people are night people, but the truth is most adults need at least 7 hours of sleep. So I am a sleep zealot. I have many habits related to making sure that I get enough sleep. I'm a knowledge worker. My brain is all I have. So I got to wake up, like refresh and recharge. I started taking a nap, a 25-minute nap. This for 2022, that's one of the new habits that I'm experimenting with, because I'm sure you've seen there's a tremendous amount of research about the benefits of taking a nap. And I fortunately had the flexibility to take a nap. So that's a new habit. A kind of interesting habit that I've been doing this year is because I'm not this year, but for a while now, because I'm working on a book about the 5 senses. I started going to the Met every day. So I get it because I live very close to the Met. I'm so fortunate. And what I realized is that many people have this where they'll do something every single day. They'll walk on the same path, or they'll go look at, some view of a river and take a picture of it every single day. And there's something about that repetition. And that maybe goes back to your idea of reflection, that there's something about just the familiarity and seeing the slow change over time that kind of helps you feel connected to yourself and to time and to a place in a way that's very refreshing. So that's kind of a more idiosyncratic habit that I've experimented with that I really enjoy.
I put this question to my mastermind yesterday. I offer a journal prompt, and it was, what is one thing that makes you happy? And what could you do every day to make sure that shows up? So maybe that's germane to the next topic, which is how can you change your habits?
Well, that's the $1 million question. Absolutely. So I wrote this book Better Than Before because there are 21 strategies you can use to make or break your habits. And the fact is, some of them work very well for just about everyone, like the strategy of convenience. If you make something more convenient, you're much more likely to do it. If you make it less convenient, you're much less likely to do it. And you can harness this. Like if you don't want to watch TV, put your remote control on a high shelf on the other corner of your house. And it's like, you can't just flop down and turn on Netflix. Like you got to work for that. Those work for just about everybody. But then there are strategies that are very, very effective for some people, but are not effective for other people. They can actually be counterproductive. So for instance, when you're facing strong temptation, a lot of people want to change habits related to a strong temptation related to eating, drinking, scrolling. So for some people, the strategy of abstaining is very effective. For me, it's easier to have none than to have a little bit. I can have no cookies or I can have 10 cookies. I can't have 1 cookie. But for some people, they do better when they have a little bit, sometimes. And so for them, moderation is better. And so you really have to say to yourself, am I a moderator or an abstainer? Because if an abstainer tries to moderate, it doesn't work very well. And a lot of people get really frustrated because they keep trying to do something in a way that just isn't right for them. It's not that it's not a perfectly effective strategy. It's just not in a strategy that's effective for you, because people are different. Another thing is accountability. So many people need accountability. And I have my 4 tendencies framework that divides people into upholders, questioners, obligers, or rebels, depending on how they respond to expectations, which is part of what accountability is. It's outer accountability, outer expectation. So for some people, accountability is crucial. It is necessary, even for an inner expectation. Even if I want to get back into yoga, or I want to meditate, or I want to keep a New Year's resolution. For some people, obligers, they still need outer accountability. If I want to read more, I join a book group. But for some people, it's actually counterproductive. Some people, rebels, they don't like somebody looking over their shoulder. They don't want to have check-in meetings. They don't want to sign up for a class. They don't want to work out with a trainer. The fact that somebody's checking on them is going to make them want to resist. Well, these are exactly the opposite. So so once you know your tendency, or you know someone else's tendency, if you're trying to get somebody else to do something, which be honest, a lot of the time we're trying to get somebody else to do something. You can tailor an approach so that it's right for that person. Because again, all these things work for some people great. But what happens is a lot of times people get discouraged and frustrated with themselves because they're like, well, everybody else can do it. What's wrong with me?
So do you have a quiz in one of your books that someone can take to see? I know that we're going to talk about that Four Tendencies framework in just about a second here, but where can somebody go to get that quiz to understand what personality type they are?
Yeah, it's a very short free quiz. Go to gretchenrubin.com/four tendencies, FOUR tendencies, and it'll tell you what you are and spit out a report to tell you what to do with that information. And then of course I have a whole book, The Four Tendencies, which really gets into the nuances of it. Because people are like, oh, I have a rebel 7-year-old. What do I do? Or my boss is a rebel, or my boss is a questioner. How do I manage that? But right, if you just want to know what you are, that quiz will tell you. It's just like 11 questions or something.
Before we move on from that point, though, and by the way, I see some folks are live and they're watching our interview today, Gretchen. I encourage you to please submit your questions, and I'm going to submit those to Gretchen at the end of our chat here. But please feel free to start putting your questions into the chat function. Gretchen, I often say when you're on that precipice, when you're on that brink and you need to make a decision, do I have the apple? Do I have the apple tart? The apple tart is way more tempting, but I said I wanted to lose weight. How do you remember your why? Where does your why fit into this entire scheme of things we're talking about?
Well, that's such a good question, because just the fact that you're saying that is giving me a sense of what your tendency might be.
Yeah.
Because for a lot of people, the why doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter. Tapping into the why doesn't really effectively help them change their habits. For them, probably outer accountability would be a much better way. Like to have a nutrition coach or to have like an accountability partner. Like, I'm going to text you a photo of every single thing I eat. If that's, useful to you. Some people find that's kind of, is not a helpful way.
Yeah.
Think about your duty to be a role model for someone else. I have other people in my household and I want to show them that like we can enjoy healthy foods. We don't always need to reach for sweets. Or just like, don't buy it, just say like, I'm just not going to buy it. I'm not going to bring it in. Because I think for some people connecting with the why is extremely powerful. Mm-hmm. And for some people connecting with the why is really, it's sort of helpful and interesting, but it doesn't actually change their behavior. Because that's what I'm interested in, is not what is just sort of like intellectually satisfying, but what is actually going to make you change your behavior. Because often because what I found, and this is why I try never to use the word motivation, because I think motivation combines the idea of really wanting an outcome and being willing to work towards that outcome. I'm very motivated to get into shape. Well, I don't know what that means, because it might mean you really want to get into shape, or it might mean that you're actually working towards that. So I find it's more helpful to think about what is my aim and what am I going to do to reach that aim effectively? Because if you get into your head, I think a lot of times people think if they whip themselves into a frenzy of desire, their actions will follow. But then that doesn't happen. And then they're like, well, what's wrong with me?
Well, Gretchen, how much time do you spend talking about the subconscious mind? Because a little bit of what we're really referring to here is willpower versus scripts that are on autopilot, right? And we know that your subconscious is driving 95% of your decision making. You're talking about repetition. We tend to do the same things over and over again until we check ourselves. And then when we actually sit and do some investigation is when we're able to see, oh, that's how I'm hardwired. Now I can start to make some changes. So I wondered if you had some thoughts on that.
Well, about 50% of happiness is hardwired. It's genetically determined. So, you're born a Tigger or an Eeyore, and that you bring that into the world. And then about 10 to 20% is something called life circumstances. So that's things like health, education, income, marital status, things like that. And then all the rest is very much influenced by our conscious thoughts and actions. And that's really what I focus on. So I really ignore everything that's out of, like, I never talk about, brain, the cortex or adrenaline, or, because I'm like, I can't directly affect my adrenaline or, my endorphins. I'm just thinking about like, well, what can I consciously shape with my conscious thoughts and actions? Because that's really where we can act with with more certainty. So I spend all my time thinking about that. And because I think that it's easier to go from the outside to the inside than from the inside to the outside. So I just find that a more effective way to go about it.
All right, so let's move to tips. What are some tips for anyone who's listening here that wants to stick to their habit resolutions but is struggling to be able to do that?
Well, one thing I would say is take the quiz and find out your tendency, because your tendency is going to give you a lot of insight into how to most effectively go about it. Because if you find out that you're an obliger, and that is the biggest tendency for both men and women, you're probably saying to yourself, like, well, I always keep my promises to other people, so why can't I keep my promises to myself? Well, that is like what happens when you're an obliger. Get that outer accountability that you need. There's many, many ways to create outer accountability once you know that's what you need. And so then you can build that in. And so that's a really good way to do it. Another way, back to this idea of convenience and inconvenience, is like, just go around and make it very easy to do the things that you want and very hard to do the things that you don't want. For instance, I've talked to people who sleep in their exercise clothes so that they do not have to, and I'm looking for my phone. And then just like on your phone, it's in color. You can switch your phone to, you can switch your phone to grayscale. Let's see, I'll do it. And then it's much harder to use it. It's like using your grandparents' black and white TV set. It's much more difficult. It's much more alluring. So it's just like, it's harder to use it because it's less convenient. It's less pleasurable. You're going to put your phone down. Another thing to think about is other people. We are swapping habits amongst ourselves for better and for worse. Like if you have a married couple and one is really good about going to the doctor, the other one gets better. If you have one that develops diabetes, the other one is more likely to develop diabetes. So we pass these habits back and forth. So you want to think about that. You know, can I put myself in the company? If I want to do a lot of yoga, do I have some friends that are really into yoga and I can go out of my way to sort of put myself in that company? Or I can even like read articles and journals and things like that are going to like make me feel like, oh, this is what one does. And so that helps.
One more habit.
Oh, one more.
So we've got convenience, make it super easy.
Yeah, these
make
are
sure you install the right people around you to make sure that you follow through. And then what's one more for those who are still skeptical about this whole thing actually working out for them?
Well, one of the funniest one, I mean, this is the chapter that I loved writing the most, was the one about loophole spotting. Because when we're trying to keep a habit, we are really good at figuring out loopholes to let ourselves off the hook. Like, you know, there's the tomorrow loophole. Doesn't matter what I'm doing today because I'm going to be so good starting tomorrow. Or there's the moral licensing loophole, which is I've been so good yesterday. Now I get to be bad today. Or there's the fake self-actualization loophole, which is on such a beautiful day, I deserve to like be outside in nature and not sit here and work on my PhD. It's like, okay. Anyway, so there's 10 loopholes. So looking out for those loopholes, because we're all adults and sometimes we want to make a mindful exception to a habit, and that's fine as long as it is mindful. So being aware, there's 10 kinds of loopholes, being aware of what they are. Most of us have a go-to one. Mine is false choice loophole, which is like, I don't have time to go to the dentist because I'm so busy working. It's like, really? Like, you really can't find time to go to the dentist? Because I think you can. That's a false choice loophole. So once you're sort of aware of that, you can often catch yourself slipping into it. And then you do a better job of sort of saying, okay, what do I, like back to what you were saying before, like mindfully with reflection, what do I want to ask for myself? And when do I want to give myself that time off?
You know, what's interesting about what you just said, though, that some people don't feel like they even deserve to put their own self-care first.
Oh, those are obligers. Those are obligers. Yeah.
And I often do like a deserve level test. And I'll say finances, relationship, health. And I'm interested to see how people rank their deserve level, not where they are on how great their health is, but how much they deserve that. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on deserve levels.
Well, I do think if you feel like that's an issue, you're probably an obliger. So I would look to outer accountability. But another way to frame the same thing that I think for some people maybe feels less loaded is treat yourself like a toddler, right? Like, you know, a toddler needs sleep. A toddler can't get too hungry. A toddler can't be jerked from one thing to another without a little bit of transition. A toddler needs time to relax. Like, treat yourself like a toddler. Or if that doesn't ring true for you, treat yourself like a puppy. Would you treat a puppy the way you treat yourself? A puppy needs fun and exercise and healthy food and company and affection. Like, treat yourself like a puppy, because I think and this is also kind of a trick that a lot of people talk about, which is if you think about yourself in the third person. Like, sometimes people will say, imagine that you're talking to a friend. What advice would you give to a friend in your situation? Sometimes by kind of getting outside of ourselves and thinking of ourselves in the third person sort of unlocks something. So I think for some people, if it's hard for them to think about what I deserve, because that maybe gets complicated for them, if they're like, well, would I treat a puppy this way? Would I treat a toddler this way? Would I treat a friend this way? Maybe allows them to see what they themselves need and deserve.
I love it, Gretchen. All right, let's get to these Four Tendencies framework. And again, I'm going to welcome everybody that's tuning in here live to put your questions in the chat, and I'm going to get to them as soon as we cover off on this Four Tendencies framework. So let's get started. What does this mean, first of all? What was the genesis of this?
So as I said, I was studying the like habits and the patterns and habits, and I began to notice these really deep patterns. And it became crystal clear to me when a friend said to me, I know I'd be happier if I exercised. And the weird thing is, when I was in high school, I was on the track team and I never missed track practice. So why can't I go running now? And I thought, well, why? Because it's the same person, it's the same behavior. At one time, it was effortless. Now it's really challenging. And I could think of many hypotheses about why that was. But what I realized, that at the heart of it, it's this idea of expectation, that we all face outer expectations, like a work deadline, or inner expectations, like my own desire to keep a New Year's resolution. And depending on whether we meet or resist outer and inner expectations, that's what makes us an upholder, a questioner, obliger, or rebel. And so in the case of my friend on the track team, when she had a team and a coach expecting her to show up, she showed up no problem. When she was just trying to go on her own, she struggled. And that meant she was an obliger. She readily meets outer expectations, but she struggles to meet inner expectations. And therefore, she needs outer accountability. So my friend started working out with a friend who got really annoyed if she didn't show up for their group their team workout, and that's what kept her going.
For anybody that's struggling to find an accountability partner, any tips on that? Because I think to you and I, living in New York City, we network all the time. We've got a big social circle. It's pretty easy peasy, but I realize that when I travel, that I take a lot of this for granted. It is not as easy to find someone who's like-minded that's going to hold you accountable.
Well, that's a great question. And the fact is, a lot of people don't want to have an accountability partner that's another person. Like, many introverted obligers are like, oh my gosh, like the idea of checking in with a person makes me feel overwhelmed, because like I already have so much social stimulus in my life. I don't want to like take a swim class or like join a group text. So yeah, there's many forms of accountability that don't require that. And what's really interesting is that for obligers, they are responsive to very different things. So even as an obliger, you might have to experiment to see what kind of accountability works for you. For some obligers, like getting an auto reminder from an app. Like, I have this app, the Happier app, and for a lot of people, using an app is enough. Some obligers can even use kind of what I would call their imagination, like their duty to their future self. If I come to the end of this year and I have not like really spent that time on yoga, I'm going to be so disappointed with myself. Or my duty to be a role model for other people. I want to show other people what it looks like. But then other things, because this is such a big issue for people, there are many. Focusmate, I think, is the name of the app, where like you can log on and work. And there's a cafe in Japan where you can go and get accountability. Wow. I think there's coaches for everything. And I think the reason that there are nutrition coaches and executive coaches and organizational coaches and every kind of coach you can imagine is that for a lot of people, that's what they need. They need the professional advice, but even more than that, they need the accountability. And I'm a big fan of sort of professional, because it's a lot of work to hold someone accountable. If you can afford it, it can be very effective. But one thing I should say is that one thing that does not typically work is sweethearts and spouses as accountability partners, for a very romantic reason. It's, oh, honey, I am so close to you. You are like me. And so I'm going to ignore you just the way I would ignore me. And so sometimes you want to think about that as you're creating accountability. Children, if you have a child in your life, they make great accountability partners. If you're like, hey, when you're doing your homework, I'm going to be writing my novel that I'm writing in my free time. And if I'm not writing my novel, you don't have to do your homework. And that child will be your accountability partner for sure.
So good. So good. All right, Gretchen, a question from a professional woman. She's like, I'm really thinking about happiness in the context of my job.
Yes.
I want to be happy, even though it's not the perfect job. What would you recommend to someone who's a woman leader, not just somebody, a junior associate, but a woman leader who has a little bit of authority and agency over which way things can go?
Well, one of the things that the research shows is that the people who say they are happy at work have a friend at work. And so this is not just a casual acquaintance that you're like making, conversation at the coffee machine. This is someone who has your back. This is someone to whom you would confide an important secret. And so sometimes with work, it can be a challenge to go from having acquaintances to true friends. I think this is going to be a growing challenge now that we're increasingly hybrid. So maybe we're not having those face-to-face encounters that kind of can more easily slide you into that kind of friend space. So you really want to think about if there's somebody that you sort of like, can you get them into that level of intimacy where you would say this person is a true friend? Often that's things like inviting them to your home, making plans outside work that have nothing to do with work. Like, oh, we're both into this band. Let's go to this concert. Or we both really want to see this movie. Let's go, something where you're explicitly acknowledging that you have a relationship that's bigger than work.
Gretchen, this next question is about values. This person did a values exercise and realized that adventure and beauty were their top values. Freedom was pretty far up there as well. And when they get out of alignment with their work, they look back on their day and they figure out, was some element of their value showing up in order for them to stay happy? And they wondered what you thought about the values piece of it.
Well, this person sounds like a rebel to me, because when people start talking about freedom and choice, it sounds like this person maybe values spontaneity, I'm guessing. That starts to sound like rebel language to me. And so I would say one of the things to do is to think about harnessing the powers of the rebel tendency, but also thinking about the things that tend not to work for rebels, which is like feeling very trapped by a calendar, feeling like there's a lot of, supervision. And the more that you can make yourself feel like I'm just doing what I choose every day, I'm doing what I feel like doing. Rebels often thrive in work situations where there's a lot of variety. So say, for example, I talked to a rebel who was a restaurant manager. And so every day she would go to a different restaurant and kind of check in. So there was a lot of different people and she was sort of on the road and nobody ever really knew where she was. She could kind of set her own schedule. That kind of thing tends to work very well for rebels. And so part of it, I think, is recognizing that this is something that as this person is doing, realizing that these are very high values, which is incredibly useful and significant work to do. And then to think like, okay, well, am I in a place which is really going to allow me to harness the power of this? Because I'll say I'm an upholder. That's the opposite of a rebel. I put no value on adventure. Like 1 out of 100 on adventure. I'm not a very adventurous person. So this is not a universal value. So it's very valuable that some people like adventure. And it's valuable that some people don't really like adventure and don't really need adventure to feel like happy. So I think it's really good to think about these values and then how to incorporate them into what is your daily life.
Gretchen, you've got 4 books, The Four Tendencies, Better Than Before, The Happiness Project, and Happier at Home. What are we going to learn from reading Happier at Home?
So when I wrote The Happiness Project, I was focused on sort of the deep, kind of like the overview understanding of happiness. And then the more I got into it, the more I realized, I'm very fascinated, what would you say is universal? Very few things, it turns out, are universal. But it turns out that if you're not happy at home, it's very hard to be happy. So in Happier at Home, I went much deeper into sort of the experience of home with things like neighborhood, marriage, family, time, possessions, and looked very closely at those as related to happiness. I mean, an earlier listener was saying she wanted to be happy at work. Well, you could write a book about happiness at work, because obviously work is super important to our happiness because we spend so much time at work and have so much invested in work. But in Happier at Home, I talked about home, which is another very important issues. So if those are the kinds of things that you're most interested in or want to work on, that's the book where I go deeper into that.
Gretchen, what's a question I should have asked you today that I didn't?
Oh, what a good question.
This is the journalist in me. This is always my final question I ask anybody, because maybe there's something that I left on the table and there's some magic gold there.
I think we hit the most important thing, which is that there is no magic one-size-fits-all solution for happiness. What is the other thing I would say? Well, I guess I would say, when we talked about it briefly, but just to come back to it, which is in the end, we're so wired for people. Relationships matter to us so much. So if you're trying to think about what to do with your precious time, energy, or money, anything that broadens your relationships or deepens your relationships is probably something that's going to make you happier. And obviously for some people, that means like a big crowded cocktail party. And for some people, that means like a quiet walk through a park with a friend, or even just like a moment of chit chat with the drugstore clerk can give us a lift.
You know, that is a great answer to this question that I answer in my journal every night. And it's like, how could I feel more connected to other people today? And I can never answer the question, but that might be it, because I work from home. I'm usually by myself. I feel like I'm talking to people all day long, but maybe it's the simple act of picking up the phone and speaking to a friend as opposed to a work colleague.
Yeah. No, it's such a great question. Yeah. No. And because of the way that we're relating to each other is changing so dramatically over the last few years, I think we're all having to reevaluate what our practices are and what we need to build in moving forward as things change.
Gretchen, if anyone wants to work with you, how do they get in touch with you? I'm putting your link here in the banner about how to get the quiz, but if anyone wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
Well, you can go to my website, GretchenRubin.com, and there's the quiz and information about my books and tons of free resources. You can hit me up on social media at Gretchen Rubin. I'm all over the place and all the usual spots. I have a podcast, a weekly podcast where I talk about practical tips for how to be happier, healthier, more productive, and more creative, which I co-host with my sister, who's a Hollywood showrunner. So she's got a big job of her own. And that's called Happier with Gretchen Rubin. So you can listen to that wherever you get your podcasts. And I love to hear from people. I love questions and insights and examples and observations. So, and you can email me through my website too. It comes right to me. So I'm wildly accessible, and I love to hear from people. I feel like the world is my research assistant. So yeah, hit me up.
Awesome. And I host a mastermind for executive women and business leaders. You'll notice, Gretchen, behind me, I'm in a photo studio today because we're getting everyone's headshots done for their personal brand.
Oh,
and
great.
So if anyone wants to get in touch with me, you can always get in touch with me at joya@joyadas.com. Gretchen, this was great. Again, like I said, as I started when we first started this whole conversation, is that I'm thinking about my own daily contentedness and how can I make sure in the next 10 years that's something that's an inside job versus an outside job. I don't need the Hermes purse in order to feel happy. And so I'm glad I got some handles on that today.
Wonderful. I so enjoyed talking to you. Thank you so much for having me.
And have fun at the Met if you haven't been there today.
It's closed today, unfortunately, but I'll go tomorrow.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay. Take care. Thank you.